Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. This is the session where we're going to talk about reimbursement issues, and we were up here on the panel talking about how lucky all of you are to sit in the audience because these people have all the answers to all the questions. So the 60 minutes is going to fly by. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Werner. I'm the co-founder. I'm the executive director of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. My day job is that I'm a health and life sciences partner in the law firm of Holland & Knight, based in Washington, D.C. And I work on regulatory and reimbursement and other government-related work for life sciences companies and other stakeholder groups. I also staff the Alliance's reimbursement committee here with the organization, and if anybody is interested in participating in that committee, by the way, we certainly welcome your participation. So just to set the stage for this talk, you know, as I think about it, I think that we live in sort of this paradoxical time now, which is to say that on the one hand, we have all of these incredible scientific breakthroughs and the potential for so many more that you've heard about this morning and that you'll hear about through the rest of this conference in terms of science that could be commercialized to treat unmet medical needs that really are a social cost and an economic cost on our society around the world, and certainly on many individual families. And yet, we also, of course, live in a time of, because of a variety of factors, not the least of which is the demographic trends in our society and elsewhere, that healthcare costs are going up. And there's tremendous pressure from both public and private payers to sort of squeeze on their outlays and the cost that they pay for things. So they are starting to demand from our industry cost-effectiveness information, comparative effectiveness information, as well as, you know, demonstration of clinical benefit. And a great example of that, by the way, is there's a recent proposal from CMS in the outpatient prospective payment system to bundle the payments for skin substitute products, which includes wound care, regenerative medicine, wound care products, and bundle them and treat them like they're surgical supplies and treat them like they're all the same, and incorporate payment for that into the payment for physicians performing a procedure where these products are used. And so it's just a great, you know, real-time example of payers looking at regenerative medicine products and trying to figure out, in some ways, how they can pay less for them. So this is the environment in which all of us are living and in which all of you are trying to develop innovative therapies to cure disease and disabilities. So it begs the question of how do we go forward and how do we accomplish that? And that's what we want to talk about today. I would like to just also let you know that ARM has developed a policy paper, or I shouldn't say it's a portfolio of chapters describing all the various payment systems that exist in the U.S., so all the different components of Medicare, private pay, Medicaid. It's a way to educate you, the members of ARM, on all of those systems, the stakeholders involved, the time frames, what you need to be thinking about as you develop your products so that you are ready to be reimbursed, or you're in the best position you can be to get maximum reimbursement for your product. We have a few copies outside on the table. We have posted it on our website, and I encourage all of you to take a look at that. So just a little bit of housekeeping for our panel. We're going to start with, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and talk and describe the big challenge that they see in terms of reimbursement. We do not have any slides. No one has a PowerPoint presentation. This is meant to be an interactive discussion, conversation. I'm certainly going to ask questions. The panel will interact with each other. I encourage you to participate in this session. This is not meant to be a lecture. This is meant to be a conversation and a discussion. So as we go, if folks have a question or a comment, please raise your hand. We're not going to have a presentation and then Q&A at the end. If you hear some of the speakers talk about something or one of my questions provokes a thought in your mind, please raise your hand and I'll recognize you, and then we can just engage in a conversation. So with that, I'd like to ask the panel to introduce themselves and describe what they see as a major regenerative medicine reimbursement challenge. And we'll start with Faraz.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Faraz Ali. I'm head of commercial for Bluebird Bio. We are a clinical stage gene therapy company, recently public. As of June, we use lentiviral vector technology to treat severe genetic diseases with unmet medical need. Our lead indication is adrenal leukodystrophy. We also have programs for beta thalassemia, and we intend to launch a study for sickle cell disease next year. We also have a collaboration with Celgene Corporation on chimeric antigen receptor T-cell therapy for hematologic malignancies as well as solid tumors. So we're busy and we have a lot going on. I think the challenges are many that people have already talked about earlier in the conference today. In our case in particular, I think our procedure is a transplantation procedure that sits on top of an allogeneic or autologous transplant procedure. And so there are certain, as we were talking about earlier, pricing and reimbursement dynamics that are associated with autologous and allogeneic transplant procedures that are difficult as is. And then on top of that, we want to add the gene therapy layer to that. The opportunities, however, are numerous, and we think that this is a potentially transformative and curative approach for a whole range of diseases. And we already have clinical proof of concept for that. So we think that we'll be able to create value, and our challenge will be to, on an indication-by-indication basis, try to capture some of that value. And I think as the panel goes on, we'll talk about that in a little more detail. So.
Thanks. And I will give Faraz a plug. He's the vice chair of our of the Alliance Regenerative Medicine the Alliance Regenerative Medicine Reimbursement Committee, and so we appreciate that. Joel.
Michael, thanks so much for inviting me here. I'm Joel Brill. I'm an internist and gastroenterologist, so I'm not, I don't come from your world, but then again, I'm not sure that I look many of you eye to eye. I look at a different part of the anatomy from day to day. My background is that in addition to having been in practice, I was a medical director for one of the health plans here in California, responsible for minor things like pharmacy and coverage and things of that nature. And I currently sit on the national advisory plans for 3 national health plans. I've been on the CPT panel for about 15 years. I've been on the RUC, that's the Relative Value Update Committee, for about 14 years. Was the vice chair of the Practice Expense Subcommittee. That's everything that goes into cost that isn't related to physician work, for about 4 years' time. So one of the questions that I'm going to be very interested in, and hopefully we can have a dialogue, is when you start thinking about efficacy and the like, how do plans think about things from a relationship of outcomes, cost as well as clinical? What's the horizon and the time frame? When we talk about curative, what does that mean to, for example, Medicare, where that patient is in the plan for life, versus someone who might be in an exchange or marketplace, or someone who might be in a commercial plan who might only be there for 3 to 5 years' time. And trying to address some of those questions and a needs perspective, I think drives a lot of what types of trials you do, what kind of data you collect, and how do you position that in terms of making your value proposition. And the other thing, if we do have time, is also asking the question, are health plans and CPT and HCPCS codes, are those really necessary if, for example, here in California, we've already evolved from the standpoint of seeing provider-based risk-bearing groups who are taking 100% of the risk. So if the risk really has devolved down to the level of the provider group, do you really need a CPT code to demonstrate your value, or do you just need to be able to collect the data that shows the entity how you improve the outcomes?
Eduardo?
Hi. So thank you as well for the invitation, and I was just brought into the panel, I think, to give you the European perspective. So I'm the CEO of TiGenix. We're a Belgian quoted company. We have was the first approved product of the regenerative medicine in Europe, and we have the first reimbursed regenerative medicine product in Europe. And just to give you an idea, I'm here to make sure that you understand that once you go at the end of this horror trip of getting reimbursement in the US, then you go to a worse story, which is trying to get reimbursement in Europe, where you have, you need to convince 17 different bodies. Each country has its own reimbursement conditions. So, I will try to share some of what we've going through today and for the last 4 years now, since we got approval, and with some successes, some failures. But, that's the problem with the pioneers, is that you try to make it to the West Coast before you're being killed by the Indians. I think that we've lost half the troops, but we're still making good progress.
Ken?
Yes, I'm Ken Witter. I'm a pathologist by training, but I deviated course early in my career and became a serial entrepreneur, being CEO of 5 different companies and then getting into venture capital. From a venture capital perspective, reimbursement is a very critical issue. That being said, I don't think any of us really do it very well in terms of trying to evaluate whether a company that we're looking at truly will be in a position to get reimbursement, and if so, how will it be reimbursed? I think we wave our hands in that regard, quite honestly, and I think there are some that might do it better than others, but investing in a company, hopefully, depending on your horizon of investment, being each firm is different. But if you have a 3 to 5 year horizon, I think we escape a lot of the arrows that Eduardo mentioned, because we generally, hopefully, have exited the companies prior to them being commercialized. But it's a huge, huge problem, and I don't think we have an answer. We have people we talk to, which will generally give direction, but I think the reality is, given the world we live in, I don't think anybody has a clue what will happen 5 years from now. So I don't mean to be negative or pessimistic, but I do think that we're in a situation with Obamacare being somewhat, it's the law of the land, and it's going to take shape, and how it manifests itself and what parts stay, what parts are gone. I don't think anybody knows. So I think there's some general guidelines you're going to probably get from some of the other panelists that are specifically in reimbursement that will probably hold true regardless. But I think generalities and directionality is probably the best that we can hope for on the venture side at this stage.
Stephanie?
Yeah. Stephanie Farnia, Director of Payor Policy for the National Marrow Donor Program. We do stem cell transplantation, and I think, to Faraz's point earlier, it might have some lessons learned for some of you that may be something that's might be considered a supply or some sort of thing that is a transplant-like procedure. My graduate training was in public health. This is as far from public health as you can probably get. And prior to joining the NMDP about 5 years ago, I was with the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, the national headquarters in Chicago, and put together their Centers of Excellence plans for complex cancer care. So I think to tie a little bit to what Ken just said is, in the reimbursement area, I think my biggest challenge to share with you is that it's not going to be done. You're not going to get a code or figure out, here's how we're going to pay for this, and then just that's it, and everyone goes about their business. It's going to change at least yearly, if not more so. Sometimes procedural changes from something like Medicare will throw everything out that you've worked for. Sometimes things like the ACA, and sometimes things like the shifting payer market. I think where people used to think, well, we just need to get the big 5 insurers to understand and to pay for this. Most of those health plans and insurance companies now are really just sort of transactional companies that are administering the benefits that have been decided on by the large employers, who are the new real purchasers in healthcare, or the stop-loss companies that come with them. So It's not going to be something, I wish you could say it was, that you'd get your code and you'd be golden, but it's not something like that. You're going to have an ongoing strategy on it.
Hi, I'm Rick Gerrard. I'm the Executive Director for IP and Trade Policy at Celgene Corporation. I'm actually a patent attorney by background, but about 6 months ago I made a pretty good, in my view, career transition. I now focus on IP and trade policy. I also have the privilege of being the primary corporate affairs representative for Celgene Cellular Therapeutics, which is a subsidiary of Celgene focused on stem cells derived from placental sources as well as various types of extracellular matrices. So it's been an exciting couple of months as I've transitioned into the new role. I view the lack of a clear reimbursement plan, at least in the United States and Europe, as actually a significant opportunity. It's really an opportunity to highlight the value of regenerative therapies, stem cells included. I guess time will tell. Time will tell. In the meantime, the very substantial task of getting through the FDA and EMA looms, and I think it's a great industry filled with incredibly bright people, and eventually there'll be some clarity.
So, just to pick up on a couple things that were said in the introductions, Faraz mentioned this, but obviously, Stephanie, this is really your bailiwick, and you mentioned this too. So we have this history of bone marrow transplantation, which has been going on for quite some time. So tell me what you think. You're looking at folks who are involved in cell therapy or gene therapy, trying to commercialize products. What do you think the lessons from the experience in the bone marrow transplantation world are that are applicable to this community, and what can we learn from them, and how do you think that should influence the way we approach reimbursement issues?
So I spend probably half of my time, interestingly enough, and this is something to kind of keep in mind, working with our transplant centers, hospitals, and helping them figure out how they're going to get reimbursed. So I think I would sort of think, just ballpark that you're going to have to spend a significant amount of time teaching them how to do that. They don't have that knowledge inherently. We sort of divide our issues into two different camps, the private payers and the public payers. The private payers, for the most part, transplant's actually been this nicely insulated group. They tend not to have anybody who doesn't have insurance. You're not going to come into an ER and end up with a bone marrow transplant. Anybody who private pays is usually going to be a significantly wealthy individual from usually an international. They're coming in specifically for that and can write a check and pay the bill. But even for the private companies, for the most part, those are global case rates that had a significant margin for the hospitals. The administration liked that. You're usually talking somewhere 10% to 18% margin on a lot of those. And so it was a nicely cushioned program. The NMDP in particular, because we're the ones that provide the cells when somebody doesn't have a sibling, have to worry more about, most people have coverage for transplant, but maybe they don't have coverage for searching for that donor and acquiring those cells. So that could end up being $30,000 to $100,000 worth of costs that either the transplant center has to figure out if they're going to eat as part of that global case rate, if the patient's going to have to come up with some mechanism to pay for that, or is that our problem? And we've sort of seen it as a significant portion of our problem gone out and trying to do education. We have an ongoing payer advisory group where we have representation from all of the big health insurance companies. We meet on a monthly basis and have sort of co-opted them to help us think through removing financial barriers to transplant. They like that role. They like that much more so than being sort of an adversarial body for us. On the public side, our story is interesting because it's up until the last 5 years, there were very few Medicare transplants. Just as a result of people over about 55 not being able to withstand the preparatory regimen until there were some changes. So Medicare is new to us, and we're new to Medicare, and it's just been an interesting shift there. We've had to go, as Faraz had mentioned, indication by indication for coverage, and have now seen some of that erode just from a simple thing like moving from ICD-9 codes to ICD-10 has prompted the coverage group at Medicare to get rid of what they view as all of the old national coverage determinations. So I think the lessons learned from that, or even something that's a well-established therapy and has well-established indications, can one day, Michael, to your point about the bundling, you can't ever, every time one of those rules comes out, you have to keep an eye on it and sort of see what that means in your specific area.
So another potential precedent, if you want to say that, might be in rare disease products, which have come forward. They often have a high price. It seems like they've been paid for by public payers and private payers. Faraz, is there anything that we can learn from those examples that might be applicable even for a non-orphan product in this space?
So thanks for the question, and maybe I'll start where Stephanie left off and then come to that. I mentioned the challenges of the transplantation sort of paradigm, and just to sort of build on what Stephanie said, some of the challenges from our perspective. One is just this idea that it's indication agnostic, the reimbursement, whether it's an oncology, a very prevalent oncology indication, or it's a very rare disease, orphan disease, the reimbursement is going to be the same, even though potentially the value proposition of the curative potential is very different. So in that way, I think that's something that we want to break out of. Two is the idea of bundling, which Stephanie already mentioned. Another challenge for us is just the sheer range, the center-to-center variation, the country-to-country variation today, and the current sort of standard cost of an allogeneic transplant. You ask 5 different centers in 5 different countries, you'll get very different answers, but even more frustratingly, you ask 5 different centers in the United States, you'll get very different answers about what their true underlying costs are, and therefore sort of putting the reimbursement for those into perspective. And then the last sort of thing I'd bring about, discuss about transplantation is today, in some ways, like you said, it's been a protected class, partly because it's been limited on the allogeneic side by the donor availability. But our technology, by its very definition, is intended to expand the number of people. You're not going to be limited by donor availability because it's an autologous procedure. So suddenly, entire swaths of people with certain diseases that previously couldn't be treated because they simply couldn't find a good donor match suddenly are treatable. And the real one that's going to test the case, test the system, is sickle cell disease. There's 100,000 patients with sickle cell disease. A certain percentage of them are severe enough to qualify for transplant, but a very small minority actually get a curative transplant today because they can't find donors. And now if suddenly tomorrow we have technology that allows them to all get a potentially curative therapy, is the system prepared to handle that potential volume of patients? And there's a lot of other things that come with sickle cell disease. On the orphan side, my previous life, I spent 9 years commercializing therapies at Genzyme Corporation and launched some of the orphan therapeutics there in the US and Europe. And, lessons learned over there, one is, I think, this idea that, they can charge whatever they want, including things that are $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 a year, and in extreme cases, even $1 million a year. On one hand, that should sort of inform us and say, well, if you engage the healthcare system and payers in the right way, certain things might be possible that you didn't think were possible, right? And that's still continued, and many other companies have come into that. On the other hand, there is growing, I'd say, payer fatigue with that. This idea that chronic $300,000, $400,000 a year, no end in sight. And now that I'm on this side of the house, I do sort of say that payers see the value proposition of a curative approach, because that, a one-time hit, potentially curative, and now you don't see this endless $200,000 to $500,000 a year stream. So that model is already coming under scrutiny, already coming under some attack. I wouldn't suggest anybody walk out of here thinking, I'm going to start an orphan business and I'm going to be able to charge that much for Kingdom Come, because I think that model is also going to come under question. But there's certainly an interesting intersection between curative approach and orphan, which is our lead indication, adrenal leukodystrophy, ultra-orphan indication. What are you going to price that at in order to recoup your investment, but also recognize the value that you're bringing, that you're saving lives of boys who otherwise would have died? I think that's going to be one of our really big and interesting challenges.
Yeah. I think that sort of related to both of those, all of this conversation is sort of the phenomenon that companies, of course, are focused on getting FDA approval of their products and providing the safety and efficacy data that FDA demands to get the approval. But we know that when payers make decisions about reimbursement, in the cases that you described, or Stephanie, in the case you described, or Eduardo, in the situation that has been true for your company, we know that they're looking at sometimes a different set of data, right? So I just throw it out to sort of the panel. So when companies are thinking about that issue, so questions for you would be like, what kind of data do you think the payers are looking for? Sort of kinds of data are they looking for? And what would you advise, based on your experience, companies should do to try to accumulate that data so that they can go sit down with a payer, just like they sit down with FDA, and say, here's our data, here's the justification, here's our value proposition? Anyone on the panel will take that?
All right, I'll bite on that one. So payers think in a variety of ways, and the way that one payer thinks is the way that one payer thinks. That's the first thing. Payers think in silos. So they have a pharmacy silo. They have what we call as a facility silo. They have a professional silo, which is usually physician claims and may or may not include laboratory costs or not. One of the problems where this all stems from is that when Medicare was created based off of the original division between Blue Cross and Blue Shield. Blue Cross was for hospital, Blue Shield was for physicians. So Medicare has Part A, which is inpatient hospital, and Part B, which is outpatient services. So payers sometimes have a very difficult time looking horizontally. And when you explain to them that you want to spend $500,000, $1 million or more, because it's going to reduce overall costs and improve overall care, that's a concept that they can't grasp. That's the first problem. The second problem is that when you're talking about inborn errors of metabolism, you're talking about conditions that has been mentioned, it's like the ka-ching, it's the several $100,000 per year. And they do not necessarily have the time frame of horizon that you have. So you're looking at it from saying, I have a cure, I have a treatment, I'm going to solve your problem. And the payer's thinking, what's this going to cost me during calendar year 2013? And am I going to spend $1 million? And then is this patient going to leave my plan and go to your plan? Okay, I'm the one who's out, out the money, and you're getting the benefit of this patient who's had a cure.
And if I can interrupt, that also would happen if the patient population is, say, early 60s, because the health plan knows that they're going to become Medicare eligible in a few years. Right?
And also, one other thing on top of that is that at least until the end of this year, a lot of plans, and Taft-Hartley and other plans, could have lifetime exclusion. Mm-hmm. Okay? So that was another way that they could say, oh, you had a treatment that's going to cost $1 million. We have a lifetime exclusion of $1 million. So therefore, the patient goes, I can't come up with that kind of money. So those things being what payers are dealing with, what industry needs to start thinking about is looking at a care model that really balances clinical and economics and looks at the care over not 30 days or not 90 days, but really in terms of several years. You need to start looking at what is the overall cost of care model for the patient receiving conventional treatment, which is pharmacy and drugs and labs and diagnostics and surgery and everything of that nature, and create, in effect, what is this whole cost of care? And compare that to your treatment, and does your treatment over a 3-year horizon, for example, actually result in a clinical improvement at a cost that is, if not equivalent, at least fairly equivalent, where you can draw some conclusions.
Other comments, Ken?
Yeah, I recently had a discussion with one of our portfolio companies, and it turns out that a couple of the observers on the board come from large and sort of mid-sized pharma. This is a pharmaceutical company. It's not regenerative medicine. And we're doing some modeling like most companies do in preparation potentially of a launch. of this product. It's for a fairly broad indication. It's a multi-billion-dollar opportunity. And there was a comment made by one of the observers who's a head of commercialization of the company that's an investor in the identical area for a drug. And it really comes down to, first of all, his experience and lessons. Number one, any kind of data that you're getting now from payers is, as I mentioned before, directional. But more importantly, your ability to charge really, and what price you might be able to extract, and this applies to the orphan drug as well, relates to what is the amount that they're going to end up having to pay. If it's a very narrow population, if there's 50 people in the world and you're charging $400,000 a year, okay, there's a universe they can deal with, and it kind of is on their radar screen, but it's not really on their radar screen. Mm-hmm. It's one that high price that they allow you to get gets broadened out into and a lot of people use an orphan drug designation as their entry point and then say, oh, and then we're going to expand into the general population. That gives them hives, and they start their windpipe starts constricting. So I think it all depends on the population it's going to serve and what it's going to do to them on their yearly. They can see very narrowly, what's this going to do to my budget in this particular year and this particular year? And if they think that it's going to be a technology that's more broadly disseminated, I think pricing becomes more of an issue to them. Would you agree, Joel?
Absolutely. I think, as you said, if you've got an orphan you've got an orphan condition, and there's a couple of hundred people a year, and you just got bad luck. Yeah. And okay, there, but for the grace of God, go on. All right. But then you take sickle cell anemia, where and it's not you've got one or two, but you may have a Medicaid plan, right, where theoretically 5-10% of your plan could be sickle cell,
especially in the Southeast.
Especially, well, many places. And you start, getting apoplexy and anxiety attacks, and you start saying, I can't pay for this. So I think to Ken's point, picking your targets wisely is part of this assessment and analysis. And at the same time, you have to balance it, I think, by, what Ken and what both colleagues are getting at, which is that you're investing significant amounts of money, you're expecting a return, and what you don't want to do is get to the point of getting through the FDA, getting commercialized, and then finding out you can't get covered.
So sickle cell disease happens to be one of my favorite examples because I appreciate your comments tremendously. They resonate with me. Just trying to now take that extra step and say, okay, I am going to build not only a clinical, I'm going to, in my studies, test the curative potential of gene therapy for sickle cell disease, but now I also want to be responsible and say I'm going to build a cost-effectiveness argument. Maybe not for adrenal leukodystrophy because it won't matter, it's ultra-rare, they've already told us that. Mm-hmm. Don't worry about building a cost-effectiveness argument there because it's too rare. But sickle cell, come to us with one. Now, why it's one of my favorite examples, 2 years ago or so, in the American Journal of Hematology, an opinion leader in sickle cell disease did a very detailed analysis because precisely the payers don't look horizontally. Said, well, we're going to make the effort and say, for our institution, calculate the lifetime cost of a sickle cell disease patient. And they came up with a number that was roughly $1 million. In that same journal, the editor for that journal wrote an editorial refuting, and it was another opinion leader in the sickle cell disease space said, we looked at this article, we don't agree with the conclusions, we've done our own math about the lifetime cost of sickle cell disease to the United States, to society, and that's $9 million. So these are not naive people. These are two opinion leaders in the sickle cell disease space who are actively managing sickle cell disease patients. Two different sets of calculations. One comes up with $1 million lifetime cost, one comes up with $9 million. And that just speaks to even when we are ready to take that next step into doing the cost effectiveness analysis, doing the QALY analysis, the incremental cost effectiveness, it is not going to be easy because the data sets are just going to be all over the place. And again, that center-to-center, pair-to-pair variation, we're just going to have to learn how to navigate that and maybe negotiate in advance what is that data set and what is that methodology that you intend to use to try to make your argument. Otherwise, you could do the best possible calculations and meet somebody who says, well, you're off by like an order of magnitude.
So really, the question isn't whether my hotel is nicer than your hotel. The question really is, can we all define the roadway that we're to get there? Because if we can all define what goes into what that either lifetime cost of care or even 5-year cost of care model is, then the payers, and I think Stephanie can speak to this as well, the payers can then look at their own data, because a payer in Chicago is going to have a different cost structure than a payer in Charlotte, right?
I mean, I laugh when you said they can look at their own data, because sometimes they can't. So that's, you can't really assume that. But I think it's important to not, I hear a lot of discussions where it almost paints this picture of the payers as like the evil troll guarding their pile of money under the bridge, right? And you're just trying to trick them to moving a little bit so you can snatch some of the money and run away. But they're concerned about that because they're accountable to their customers too, right? You all pay a monthly premium for health insurance. And as more and more companies have gone self-funded, you know, and health plans spend a lot of their time trying to recruit Target and Boeing and everybody else to be the administrator of their benefits, and you're the health plan that has green-lighted a lot of very expensive therapies because there's this, you know, 5-year value proposition or something, and you take that bill back to Target at the end of the year and say, here you go, and they're looking at it trying to figure out why it's so much more than what they thought. They are going to be concerned about getting people back to work. So if you can make that argument that your particular therapy is cost effective in a 1 to 2 year time horizon and get somebody back to their desk and working, that is something of interest to those self-funded employers. You know, but otherwise, those health plans, it's not just that they don't like you or they don't value what you're doing, but those big companies every year do their annual RFP process, and if everybody's just administering the benefits, they go with the cheapest. So it's important to sort of think through why they're putting up some of those barriers and see where you can come in, and not to play the everybody's special. When you're a payer, everybody's special. Everybody's got a reason about why they should get paid more or differently or something like that. So the more you can understand the ways that other things that are like you are paid, or other mechanisms that payers use, and come in with a smart, practical understanding of that, I think the better off you're going to be.
Eduardo, you want to say something?
Well, I want to be a little bit more holistic here. I think that one of the problems is that at one point we will not have the money to pay for the advancement. Maybe I'm being negative, but I think that if you look at what we're all developing and what our hopes are that we're going to be paid for the things that we're going to be developing, there won't be enough money for all of us. So I think that at one point, I think that people will have to look into, you know, it's great, we're going to be curing diseases. We will not be able to charge, you know, the lifetime cost of, you know, AMI if we were to cure AMI today, simply because there will be no money. Something that is funny now when you have discussions in Europe is that once you start thinking that you're going to extend people's life above 65, that penalize your numbers. Because people after 65 cost a lot of money. So, you know, extending life after a certain amount of years, you're actually incurring in much more cost rather than saving cost to the system. So to your question, which I think that we've gone out a little bit, is I think that we should engage payers the sooner the better. I think that even if they promise that whatever they tell you is going to be true, it will be directional, will be the best you're going to get. Because let's face it, we're developing things today that we're aiming at getting reimbursed 10 years from now. And 10 years from now, no one knows what's going to happen. So get them in and, you know, take a zero out of the number that you end up with today. And if you cannot live with that number, probably you don't have a drug that will make money in the future. I think that that's going to be as tough as that.
And I don't know if there's an analog in the regenerative medicine side, but it's certainly in the pharmaceutical side, you got to beat the hell out of generics. Generic is where everybody starts, and then there's step edits to get you to better performing drugs. So I think that's going to be when cost really becomes the bottom line here. People are going to say, well, what can we get by with so that we are treating patients and we are giving them, you know, an acceptable form of therapy. It may not be optimal, but it's acceptable. So that's that's probably in the back of the mind of most of the payers that certainly we've interacted with is you really got to beat the pants off of generic and demonstrate that it's a cure versus amelioration of disease symptoms.
Well, wait a second. You have to look at this. You know, if you're a researcher and you've built your career off of NIH R01 grants, you know what the worst possible thing is? To find a cure, because then no one's going to fund you any longer. Okay.
You can take your Nobel Prize.
So, you have to realize that there's multiple different conflicting and competing interests, and some people who you think are your friends aren't.
Sort of kind of along those lines. So I want to also talk about, we're talking, of course, about drugs being reimbursed or biologics reimbursed. But a big factor, I would assume, right, in terms of sort of product success has to do with hospital and physician reimbursement in terms of the use of the product or administration of the product or the procedure. So ask the panel to sort of talk a little bit about that. And so it seems to me then that, right, companies should also be thinking about, well, in addition to me getting paid for my drug, I'm going to want to make sure that a doctor is going to have every incentive to administer my drug, or a hospital will, get paid appropriately in the transplant center or what have you. So that also seems to suggest that a good strategy is to start identifying your clinical partners and start working with them perhaps on a reimbursement strategy together. Thoughts about that? Easier said than done?
So having been in the environment of CPT, there's a lesson. You can get paid without having a code. Having a code does not guarantee coverage, nor does it guarantee reimbursement. And the third thing is that in today's environment, it is assumed that anything that is not a primary care service is woefully overvalued and needs to have its reimbursement dropped significantly. Okay, so if you start with those constructs in mind, you start asking the question, do you really want a code? Because if you think about it from a payer perspective, payers pay claims, and payers have automated audits. So if you've got a code, you just made it easier for a payer to deny payment for you. Now, Ken would say, well, gee, I really want a code because I can demonstrate the value, but I'm not really sure I'd be going for a code. The other thing I will say is that those really fine folks in Baltimore at Medicare, a couple of years ago through the ACA, slipped in a couple of sentences into the final rule in 2011. It said, if you bring a new code forward, then you need to look at all of the other codes in your family of services, and all of these codes need to come back and be resurveyed and revalued as a family in order to determine the relativity. So, Michael, to your point, how do you create an environment for a physician? You want to create a new code for a physician to do something, and the physician societies are saying, oh no, we don't want new codes because we've got a lucrative franchise here in hair transplants or discombobulation, and why would we now want to bring your new technology through because we know it's going to open us up? So the physician societies, first and foremost, may not be your friend. The second thing is that are you going to be doing this at the community hospital St. Elsewhere's, or are you going to be doing this at the academic medical center? And if you think about what's happening, California is a perfect example. In California, medical care has devolved to risk-bearing medical groups. So if the medical group, if it's Sutter or if it's Healthcare Partners or it's Sharp, if the healthcare group is, or Kaiser, obviously, if they're 100% financially at risk, could they perform this service in their centers? Or are they going to go contract with an academic medical center? And so you have to think about how your technology, where is it going to be made available at? Because if it's going to be in a community setting, there's a different strategy and a different way of getting them involved. Whereas if you've got a strategy where you're only going to be paid at NCI-designated hospitals, which get paid differently than everybody else, you may actually have a winning strategy. So you have to start thinking down to very, very significant, I would say, degrees of complexity. Who's going to do it? Where it's going to be done? Whose ox is going to get gored? And how do you make them your friend as opposed to your enemy?
Yeah, and I think you may also end up as sort of a de facto association for the places that are going to be doing this. We don't have a code for the actual cells. We're part of the transplant payment on both the private and the public payer side. So, most probably commercial global case rates, 100 days about a transplant, including the cell procurement, probably pay $300,000 and up for an allogeneic. Medicare currently pays about $65,000 for an inpatient transplant for everything. They don't pay separately for the cells. We know that on the allogeneic side, our costs alone are probably most of that. On the outpatient side, which they've started to try to go to try to decrease some of that, the current Medicare payment rate is $3,500 for an outpatient transplant. Again, sort of all in, all costs involved there. So even though we don't have a code, we have to understand the nuances of how those reimbursement rates are set, because the hospitals, the transplant centers, are one department within a big academic medical center. They're, for the most part, not going to get a lot of attention from their leadership. Their leadership's not going to take up this issue with Medicare and try to convince them to make a modification to their rate setting. So you need to be able to be willing to step into that role and help them figure it out and help advocate on behalf of the people who are using it.
Rick, I wanted to ask you sort of, you have a sense of, your company and how you're thinking about, for the products you're developing, sort of how reimbursement is going to play into some of your strategies.
Well, it's really a very central question, I think, for not only for Celgene Cellular Therapeutics, but for any company in this space. It's really the need. I mean, of course, our first priority is to patient care and safety, but also there needs to be some certainty in terms of reimbursement. Every publicly traded company has shareholders, so the certainty is really the key. Certainty is really the key.
Eduardo, I'm curious. So, talk a little bit about the situation, not only the situation in Europe, but sort of if you're a company trying to get reimbursed in Europe, going country by country, and then so how do you determine sort of which country to start with, for example, and how your strategy might change when you sort of go around the continent?
Well, there is a strategy of which countries you go first, because there is this funny system that exists in which countries will use, every time you go to a new country, in most of them they will use the average of the countries that gave you the price beforehand as the reference price. So if you start with Greece and you get a very low price, that's it. You know where you're going to end up. Or you go to Spain and then you get paid by German money, which is we're good at. So it remains a very political position. You need to start with the high price countries, and I would say the UK, and up until recently Germany was a clear example. I mean, Germany was free pricing, so you can go out and price your drug at whatever price, and then you will negotiate reimbursement. Today with the new system, and I don't know if you follow that, but Germany is becoming one of the nightmares of the industry, just because they have this system in which they're really giving a hard time, and you were mentioning, and unless you have the clinical data comparing to what they consider is the reference for your disease, you're simply not giving the price. So, a lot of the, for example, new diabetes compounds are just being refused just because they never did the trials with, metformin alone, generic metformin. So you end up with generic metformin prices for a GLP-4. So, then those products are simply not launched in Germany. And by the way, if you don't launch in Germany, then you don't have one of the high-price countries, so your average price in Europe goes down. So Is there a way to do it? Yes. Is there a secret recipe? Unfortunately not. And, for example, we were refused in France, but we got reimbursement in Spain, in Belgium, the Netherlands.
So a question also, and maybe Joel or Stephanie knows the answer to this, Eduardo. So what about U.S. versus Europe? Do European the governments in Europe or the payers? So you just said they often sort of look at each other for reference points. They look at the U.S. as a reference point, or they think the U.S. is, they're way out there. We don't even bother.
Well, we would love that it would include the U.S. as one of the prices. I mean, prices in the U.S. are significantly higher. I mean, much, much higher than they are in Europe. I think that one of the issues that actually some of the U.S. companies have is that when you translate the U.S. price and you go into Europe, I mean, you're not even to get the same price at the exchange rate. So I think that there's a significant decrease in the average price in Europe compared to the U.S. We should have an advantage, and you were mentioning before that the advantage in Europe is that the government pays for the cost from your whole life. So it should be easier to convince them that there's a long-term benefit. But at the end, let's face it, those are, as I was saying, political decisions. People stay in their jobs for a maximum of 4 years. So that's really what they worry about is, their budget. I mean, whatever happens afterwards, I don't care. I don't want to overspend my budget to cure you. I mean, I just need to make sure that I don't overspend my budget before I need to be re-elected 4 years from now.
And what about the other way? Do companies that launch products in Europe first, U.S. payers look at that data or not so much?
I don't think so. I think that you can significantly increase your price once you come to the U.S. And again, as all the people here were mentioning, every time you engage into discussions with a new payer, regardless of where they are, it's a new discussion because they will use different criteria to look for. So, when you're comparing yourself to standards of care, the standards of care in the U.S. will be higher, so it should be easier. I mean, I can tell you we're running competitive pricing for our phase 3 asset in Europe and the U.S., and we're getting basically twice the price as a target in the U.S. than in Europe.
Ken?
Yeah, I can just say that there's been public announcements by some the CEOs of some of the major pharma companies that European multinational companies that basically Europe is dead to them right now. So for exactly the reasons as Eduardo was mentioning, it's not an attractive market to a lot of the multinationals, the Novartis, Roche's, Bayer's, et cetera, because of the reimbursement schemes there. So they have continually looked to expand not only in the U.S., but they've developed a Far Eastern strategy, China strategy, et cetera, to look at expanding their markets. And they're now running into problems with China. So we may be the last man standing here in the United States.
But it's interesting because it all depends on whether you're a drug or a device. Because there are a lot of device companies right now that are launching outside of the U.S. because they can get premium pricing in Europe. And Europe's the battleground. I mean, what happens in Asia is great, but the companies come and they go, gosh, I could have gotten an example. I can get 7,500 euros for this device, and in the U.S. they're going to pay me $1,500. So we're starting to see in devices that people are launching OUS simply because they can't get decent payments here. So,
that's partly a regulatory rationale too.
Right, but it's all this microcosm. Are you a drug? Are you a device? Because they're viewed separately and differently by different regulators in different countries. And I might, if this was a device, I'd go to Turkey, for example, because Turkey's very generous right now in device payment.
I think you raise an interesting point. It really is. Even all of Europe isn't created equal. 17 different countries, different ways of approach. France is very generous towards sort of what they deem innovative technologies, and they put them under a separate category, and they're more lenient with the pricing with those. Some countries on the orphan side, the way they handle the high-priced therapeutics is we're just going to carve out orphans and create national catastrophic funds or something to handle those. So different countries take different approaches. But one thing that I find interesting that's happened is this idea of the EU network of HTA experts, right? And now there are these pilot projects that have already happened, and now people can, kind of like you apply for scientific advice with the EMA, before you embark on a major clinical study and you say, this is my protocol, this is what my endpoints, this is what I hope to prove, would you approve us if we meet these criteria? The network of HTA experts in the EU have banded together and said you create a similar dialogue on the HTA front. Now it's all new and it's all nascent, and whether that leads to sort of great stuff for all of us is still to be determined. But it's an interesting signal. They've at least created. You can't use the excuse anymore that we came to market and we didn't have a dialogue, and then now here we're having a problem that we didn't anticipate. You can talk to them in advance and get their advice, and it might be directional and it may not be accurate, but you at least have the mechanism to approach any number of HTA experts individually or collectively and lay out the potential value proposition, how you intend to demonstrate it, what kind of data you'd like to bring to the table, what kind of general sort of pricing you're going for, and then hear their advice. And they'll tell you this is what you should try to do in order to meet that strategy. They don't tell you whether they'll cover it or not. They'll just say, you're on the right track, or no, you're all not on the right track. You need to do these two other things that you're not thinking about right now, and then you might have a shot at the time, at the tail end when you get approved. So there's just some interesting activity in Europe. There's some glimmers of hope. Hopefully we're not the last man standing.
Michael, let me give an interesting corollary. 5 years ago, there were 5 proton centers in the United States. Mass General, Penn, MD Anderson, Loma Linda. I mean, a few people got proton therapy. It wasn't a big issue. All of a sudden, people realized that proton therapy was a moneymaker. And so companies sprung up, and you needed to raise $100 to $200 million, put a big hole in the ground, get a couple of proton machines. Great business. Right now, there's close to over 20, maybe even getting close to 30 proton machines in the United States. Well, the problem is there aren't that many people who need proton therapy. We don't need 2 proton centers in San Diego. We don't need 2 in Washington, D.C. We don't need one in New Jersey and one in Manhattan. The dilemma now is that the payers are starting to say, we're not going to pay for, if our language says that we can use cost effectiveness as a criteria for payment, there's no studies that have shown that proton therapy is more effective than, for example, IMRT. So it's a very chilling scenario that's occurring right now. And I think the same thing is you have to look at, are you an orphan, where you have a very narrow, very limited, very well-defined product, where no one's going to argue with it, or do you have, I'm looking away from you to say, you have a condition that's being treated in 100 or 200,000 people a year. Because if that's the case, you're almost obligated to bring the payers in the scenario, in the discussion, when you're, if not phase 1, in phase 2 of your discussion. What is the information that you want to see in order to help create a value proposition?
I would love to see Martin. Well, yeah, Luke has one for you.
Thank you. Fascinating discussion. We've had a fair amount of discussion about rare diseases, and we've had some references to beat generics. Some of us are pursuing strategies that are designed to be paradigm shifting, that are not focused on symptomology, but that are focused on understanding and targeting the fundamental cause of disease at a mechanistic level. What happens when you step forward with a potential intervention, a once-in-a-lifetime intervention that might completely alter the progress of disease that impacts many of our citizens? And how good really is the data across the system in terms of capturing the real costs of taking care of a 23-year-old man who hit a wall in his Harley and is confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life? Or at the other end of the spectrum, somebody who has Alzheimer's and who's certainly heading for institutionalization after the family's financial, physical, and spiritual assets have been depleted. How should we start thinking about those kinds of challenges?
So when I hear people give examples, I can't help my brain from jumping to the payer type that they would probably have. But I think when you're not dealing with things that are orphan or rare, or that necessarily are always going to be probably over the age of 65, I think the employers are a really powerful group. You know, this is a huge expense for them. Groups like the National Business Group on Health exist for that very reason, right? Because they're trying to figure out how to deliver healthcare in a better and more affordable way. If you've got something that you know is most likely going to affect a good portion of people at some point throughout their career, and that a large company may at any given point have a good portion of cost coming from that, I would think about trying to get in front of a few of them and trying to, is sort of an end around to the payers, starting to have conversations maybe as a group as a whole. You know, that ARM has a conversation with the National Business Group on Health and says, you know, these things are going to be important to your employees. They're going to have a major impact on your dollars. If you want them, you're going to have to ask the payers that you hire to deliver your benefits to cover them and to help you get access to those for the health of the people that work for you and that you pay for.
Eduardo?
Can I be negative?
Is that possible, Eduardo? Coming from Europe?
No. What I think is we always look at it like how much money we're going to save the system, and let's replace all that money so that we make it. Why don't we look at it is how much does it cost? How much does it cost to develop? And we just pay a certain margin on it, and then the price would be very different. And I wouldn't like it, but that's another way of looking at it. If you look at penicillin, then it should be worth probably the most expensive drug in the world, and it's not. Or if you look at vaccines, they should be extremely expensive, and they are not. So I'm not saying that every time we think about, let's see all the costs that today are spent in horrible diseases, and let's make sure that we grab all those costs back to us. And I'm not sure that's the right way of calculating the pricing.
I would pick my targets, and building on what Stephanie said, Geisinger in Pennsylvania, Kaiser Permanente here in California has the data. They have the data. So for your commercial population, they're the ones who have the three components, the facility, the physician, the out-of-network payment, and they're the ones who can probably work best with you to do the modeling because they have a controlled system. If you're talking about a condition like Alzheimer's where the care is being provided by government systems, surprisingly, Medicare and some of the Medicaid plans have that data. So they're not necessarily the enemy. You have to look at them as how do you make them your partner? Okay. The problem with industry is that industry contracts with payers to pay claims, and just because you take like a GE or a Sony, they may contract with multiple different payers to pay their claims, and the question is, are they using the same methodology across everybody, the same contracts in place? Do they have the same coverage policies in place? So a system that has one consistent set of payments and coverage is probably going to be beneficial to you. You're creating that model for transformative change.
All right. I'm afraid our time is up, so please join me in thanking the panel.